I love history for that. All right, here we go. And here we are for a Thursday morning episode of Dualistic Unity Raw. It's a short episode, so we're going to go into this and just start talking about some interesting shit right off the bat. First thing, I'm slightly hungover. I'm saying that because people tend to be under the impression that I don't drink. There's been a couple of times where people have come to hang out with us, or they've come to a retreat and we've had a glass of wine with dinner, and there's this look of, Ray's drinking. Ray does drink. Ray does not drink to excess, because I have a respect for how much that particular substance will fuck with my mind, my body, and my life as a whole. But that doesn't mean that I don't partake from time to time. That said, we were just having a very interesting discussion about a Christmas gift that I got from Amanda, which I'm very excited about, which is this Zippo lighter. Because, of course, I use a lot of lighters, and I'm always going through them. They always end up running out of fuel. And so this Zippo lighter is something I can use for years. I used to have when I was younger, loved it. So I'm looking forward to using this. But we were discussing the fact that this technology is like hundreds of years old. The idea of putting a wick inside a small metal container filled with lighter fluid, and then using a piece of flint and an otherwise, fairly ordinary just wheel with some gradient against it, or some edges on it, so that way it makes the flint spark. But that's it. That is the entirety of the technology behind this lighter, and it's changed so much for humanity. Because even think about that. Before that, we'd have to be like hitting the flint ourselves, and that's what people used to do, right? They'd actually like strike the flint against their knife, or they'd strike the flint with something else, and they'd start the fire that way. Could you imagine trying to light anything like that? It's hard. But being able to take a portable fire with you, a portable fire that, again, will light even in the rain because of the lighter fluid, it's changed a lot. It's cool when you look at it. We don't think about any of this. And now, of course, we have lighters that you use for a little bit of time and then you throw them out, which seems really wasteful when you break it down, right? Like, it's just all this plastic lighter. You use it for a little bit just for the amount of fluid that's inside, and then you just chuck the whole thing, flint and all, right? Like, it's just all garbage. And instead, you could use this, save all of that plastic, and ultimately just replace the flint from time to time, put a new wick in every once in a while. Like, you can maintain these for years. You can have it for a lifetime. But it would require you to actually learn how to open it up and do the maintenance and do all that, which may take a whole 5 or 10 minutes of your life. That's a lot.
Oh my gosh, and how much of life how much of life could be even that, like just taking the time to realize, oh, I could figure out, oh, there's actually something that goes into a lighter. Like there's things involved. I never even thought of that, dude. Like it's kind of weird for me to say, but like with so many things, you're talking about how like, the flint's hitting the thing, and I'm like, oh fuck. Yeah, it's not just like press button, fire starts. Huh. There's a whole thing to it, a whole fucking journey, and there's something you can dig into and learn, and like life can be that, just like curiosity about the most I say basic, but like that's fascinating. That stems from like one of the original inventions or discoveries, or the thing that changed the world was like, quote unquote, discovering fire, realizing that it exists in potential. And that makes me wonder right now, like how many things are out there that, we haven't, quote unquote, discovered yet, that are in potential right now. We just haven't. And like we're so far from even just looking, like being involved enough in our experience that we would be able to touch something that's actually genuinely new to us, based on, how much we feel like we know, or even just with human history, like 10,000 years of written human history, like how much do we not know from before that? That's a lot of time, that things were happening and going on. And so, inventions, discoveries, it's just based on what we've known, like what we've documented. And so who's to say that like all the things that maybe will get invented or discovered or realized in the next 100 years haven't, come and gone previously? Like this whole idea of like caveman to modern day is such a finite snippet. And so anyway, all over the place and enjoying this a lot. But like with everything, there's a lot that went in to this. Being able to have the screen here and the screen here and everything that went into a phone and like the development of that, like that's a super recent thing. And yet I don't even realize how like it used to be a wire on the wall and all wired. Like, holy Christ, life is fucking pretty incredible when you start looking at being curious about shit.
The fact that it there used how do I put this? It used to take an entire building to hold a computer. And that was a computer that could barely do anything but math. Now you're holding a computer in your hand all the time that is more advanced than anything that we've ever come up with for like the last 80 years. And it's just because it's the miniaturization of things that really changed everything. Like it's the reason that we really don't understand how things work. Like we look at our phone and we're like, wow, what is this magic black glass? Like that's really all it looks like because there's no moving parts, right? Like and if you were to hand it to anybody from like the 1800s, they would describe it as that. Like, what is this looking glass? Like it would just mystify them. But inside you have circuitry and capacitors and resistors and all of these things that at one point, like a resistor or a capacitor at one point was like this big. Like it was massive. It was a big glass thing, and it was basically, they were just huge, man. They were huge. And now they're so tiny that you can't see them. They measure circuitry in nanometers now. Right? Which is why it's so common for a phone to overheat or a laptop to overheat, because when things are that small, they melt really easy. Right? So that's why so much of our technology goes into keeping the technology cool. But if you were to really look back at it, it's the same technology. Like we're still using resistors and capacitors and chips and all that. The only thing that's changed is that we've gotten really good at making them very small. This is the thing about CPUs, like computer processors, right? There wasn't a leap in technology forever. Like we've been using the same kind of technology for the last 30 years on CPUs. We've just been doubling them up. So instead of having one CPU, they started putting two. Right. Once they figured out they couldn't make them any faster without making it even smaller and therefore more fragile, they just started doubling them up. Now you have like 4 processors in there instead of just one. But it's the same technology. Nothing had changed for a great deal of time. Right. Now you have quantum computers. And that's a different technology because that's messing with potentiality. Like it doesn't work in the same way that our current computers work, which is all logic, if then. That's it, right? That's all it does is just sequential logic. Whereas a quantum computer, and I love the fact that they're not even sure quite how that works, looks at all potential answers and then chooses the most probable, which is very much like our brain.
Very much like our brain. How like even the development of any of those things, like recognizing that, oh, the smaller it gets, the more it might melt, and like having to stop at a certain point just because of that. Like I'm not aware of any of that, and yet those are all things. Like I don't know, man. Like going back and forth with just like I don't know, like life and thinking. Like when someone will ask me, like, what do you want? What do you want your life to look? I was like, I have no fucking idea. Like any of those questions of like my ideal life, like I don't even know that anymore. I used to have an idea of like ideal shit, and like I don't even know that. But then it's left me in a spot where like I feel like I don't know what to do or say often, but like there isn't a pull to like all of the things I used to rely on to like hold on to like aren't there so much anymore. So there's nothing there. So then it's like there's the opportunity that I'm just realizing right now for like just curiosity, like being fucking curious about reality. Like there's so fucking much and so much to explore, so much to talk about and like discover and like realize and look into and like holy fuck that it's so fucked when you're on like this thought of like getting to a point. There is none of that. Like there's no exploration because it is like it's like being in a jungle or a forest or just in reality with all this shit going on. But like, if you're like this, on this path, on this trajectory, on this thought of like, figure out the right thing, 5-year plan, 10-year plan, blah, 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 next thing, next thing, next thing, got to get to this point to get to this point. It's like, there's no exploration. Life isn't this full picture of like, I can look on this desk I'm sitting on and there's like 20 things that all have a history behind them. They all came from development after development after development. But as long as I'm either looking at myself or looking at, a path or a trail, which kind of are the same thing, uh, when you come down to it, like, there's no consideration or curiosity almost at all about anything unless something that's going to get you to the next point down the path. That's the only thing you remain curious, is how to make yourself better instead of life and being curious about just reality.
I have learned so much more since leaving school than I ever did in school. And it's just because, and I've said this before, and it's something I said to my daughter when she was younger, I got better at learning. And the reason I got better at learning is because I stopped making it about me. I stopped making it about whether or not I was learning fast enough, how much I knew, whether or not I was wrong or right or anything like that. And so, because as soon as you're in that mentality, there is no enthusiasm for learning. Like, there's too much on the line. And so when you remove that pressure, you're just left with curiosity. Like, somebody asked me, how do you know all this stuff? A friend of mine once actually referred, it's funny because he was like, you're like Google. And it's not that I am, it's just that I'm super interested in a lot of things and I've read a lot of things. And as such, I have a lot of shit to say and things that I'm interested in. And so it's funny because you were asking, or you were saying, like, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I know what I want to do with my life. Fill it. Like, that's what I want to do with my life. This is why I love looking into new conspiracy theories, and I love listening to arguments, and I love listening to different bits about history, and I love listening to things about technology and science and philosophy and all that stuff, because all of it could be total horseshit, but it's interesting as shit. It's really interesting, and it fills your world. So that way it's an interesting story that you're a part of that's not the truth. Right? Because you may as well fill it with a bunch of stuff. And so I do, but I love looking back at the fact that if you were to take all of our technology back to ground level, like if you were just to put yourself in the forest, as it were, no technology, anything like that, you would have to start working out these things. You would eventually learn that you can smelt metal, that you can take it out of rocks, that you can make it into stuff like that. And eventually you would end up coming to the technology where you could make like forks and knives and a pot, right? And you make a pot. So now you got a pot and you fill it with water and you're putting it over the fire. And as the pot is coming to a boil, maybe you've made a lid for the pot. So now the water boils quickly and the lid starts to jiggle and you think to yourself, wow, that's interesting. Seems like there's pressure in there that's lifting the lid of the pot. And all of a sudden it dawns on you, I wonder what I could do with that pressure. And before you know it, a steam engine is born. Because that's how shit comes together, right? We start looking at things, we're like, huh, right? And then we start figuring out what to do with it. But it's always us looking at it, coming up with a new way to do it, coming up with something new. And it's brilliant for that. It's just we forget that. We start to take it for granted. We start to take all of these things like they've always existed. Right? Instead of recognizing, we were animals in the bush. We were animals in the bush. That's why I love the fact that some of the earliest tools that we've ever found in human history were like fish hooks that we had made out of bone. Right? Because that's smart.
Yeah, incredibly. And like, so everything has come from something, and someone just actually paying attention to it and scratching their head and then looking into it. And like, and through trial and error and trial and error and trial and error and just like working through it. But it's not even like a trial and error, like, and there wasn't the fear of failure so much when it wasn't so much about me, when it wasn't so much about my idea. And so we've seen, it's like, with that, and it all plays together, mentality, how much, and with certain maybe discoveries or realizations, there is more of a sense of control that comes with just a recognition from one to the next to the next. But then it's like that mentality as it builds then informs what things are used for too. Like we've been constantly discovering things and like, using the earth in different ways, like doesn't have to be a take. Like a lot of things we do now is just take with no regard for like impact whatsoever. It's not to say that there's like a not a give and take. Like we are the earth, we're involved in it. There are certain things, pulling things from rock, even something like oil, who knows, like cutting down trees for certain things with some sensitivity for sure. But it depends on the mentality that's then discovering these things that will then have sway over what they're used for and the detriment. And then as that it's like we're just seeing a swell of the illusion of control that then keeps getting perpetuated more and more and more through the use of new discoveries and whatnot. And so then that informs what our focuses are. And so all the whole like just the fucking way we live, like the mental stuff we deal with, psychological suffering, like isn't inherent to reality either. Like the degree to which isn't inherent. Like these experiences that like have been more normalized, like, depression and anxiety. It's like that doesn't have to be how we live at all. Like it's not inherent to humanity whatsoever. It comes from a place, stems from right and wrong and the illusion of control that then stems from, and it's all like, with the discoveries and then how we think about ourselves. Like they kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah. Imagine how much more we could do with existence if we weren't so stressed out about stupid shit. Right. And I've said this before, like it's really indicative of our priorities that we charge people to go to school. That there is in any way a fee for you to become more educated in anything like that would ultimately benefit everyone, right? But think about that. Now you're going to school, you got to pay for it, you got to find a way to pay for it, and then with all of that comes the stress. Maybe you have a student loan, maybe you borrow the money from your parents, maybe you found another way, right? But there's stress that goes with that, and so that stress is taking away from what you're learning. I mean, how many people are struggling with their student debt while trying to pass their tests, right? Or at least terrified of the impending student debt while they're trying to pass their tests. After I get out of school, I got to get a job. A job's got to make at least this much per year, and all of that's in the background where it could be just like, yeah, all right. None of that exists. Focus on what you're doing. You're going to be a doctor one day. This is important. Things like that. It's just our priorities are a bit askew, and it's just largely again just because our overall drive is commerce, money, more, having more wealth, having more accumulation, having evidence of our achievement, all of that stuff. And we never understand when enough is enough. When is it enough? Like give you an example. I stopped buying new computers, I don't know, 15 years ago. And it was because at that point, you can right now, you can go and buy a new computer and it's not really going to be that much better than it was 5 years ago, except maybe in rendering video. Because once again, now we have, see, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. We couldn't make the processors any faster without, making them melt. So what we started doing was creating peripheries, like a video card. A video card has its own processors. So there are additional processors specifically for video. So that way it takes the weight off the other processors that can do everything else. But because your video card is processors and they're only processing very fast for video and rendering and so on and so forth, or graphics and gaming and so on and so forth, there are huge fans on that thing to stop it from melting. But aside from that, it's basically the same technology. Now that's starting to change with adaptive AI. This is actually a really exciting time in terms of technology, because we are coming up with new innovations and we are coming up with new ways to use them. True, I mean, it's not true AI, but thank God, because really that's a whole other thing. Right now, this is just really clever programming. Right? It's really well structured programming, but it's not true intelligence. But we're getting very good at it, and we can use it for a number of things. But again, there's a danger, isn't there? In the same way that we don't recognize that this is a tool, we just look at it as part of our life. It can take over our lives, and the same is true for AI, ChatGPT, or Google's new one. What's it called? Is it Gemini? I think it might be Gemini. Crazy. If you get a chance to go and check out the trailer for Gemini, it's really quite impressive. And the reason I say it's impressive is because it's a visual AI, which means that it's watching you through the camera, and it can identify what you're doing. It can identify objects in three-dimensional space, tell you about them, and then recognize when they're changed. It's very impressive when it comes to programming. Absolutely. But again, you can see that and you're like, oh my God, like that could be used for blind people. This could be used for so much in terms of tools. So yeah, absolutely. More than likely, that's not what it's going to be used for. It's going to be used for some other ridiculous purpose that's ultimately just to make money. Right. And that's the point, is that we forget that the tools are beautiful. It's our mentality that fucks it up. It's our mentality that turns a video game into something that's an escape rather than something that can be used to train your dexterity and hand-eye coordination. And this is something that they did a study 10 years ago, something like that, showing that medical students who played video games were often better with hand-eye coordination and dexterity in surgery. And it's because of the video games training that. No, video games have no purpose. They're bad for you.
Oh my god, and, like, with everything, we wanna think that there are certain things that are good and certain things that are bad, but that stems from the mentality, just the desire to label certain things. Like, the amount of times that I hear someone say, like, "Oh, social media, it's bad. It's a bad thing for humanity," is
Doom
they're like,
scrolling.
yeah, yeah, it's like, there's a lot on there, like, you can just follow accounts that are like, teach you about something and, like, learn stuff, like, it can be straight up more helpful than school, it can be more helpful than so many different things, it's just a tool, and, like, I've had this conversation, there have been people who are like, "No, no, but it's like, it skews bad because it what do you mean?" And they'll just come up with like, "Oh, it's harder to less attention, whatever."
They're
And it's just
catering to advertisers, Andrew. They're catering to advertisers. It's like, yeah, and you have the ability to disregard that shit, right?
but that takes responsibility. It's like, no, they shouldn't put the advertisements in front of me. They're enticing me into looking at the advertisements. Like, no one's forcing it. One, no one's even forcing you to be on the app. Like, if it's impacting you that much, like, you can delete it too. It's not like a necessity. And then I've had that conversation. People are like, oh no, it's how I communicate with people, or
God, I got to
whatever.
get my dopamine, man. It's my
Yeah.
dopamine hit. I'm addicted to the dopamine, and there's all kinds of excuses. There's all kinds of excuses, but it's never on me, right?
Because even with that, even with the dopamine stuff, like how I don't know. And it's not to say like chemical. We've been talking a bit about chemicals and whatnot. It's not to say chemicals are a thing, like aren't a thing. There's definitely chemicals, but like having impact. But every time you pin it to like a chemical or something, it's a lack of responsibility. Like
But you
it's
forget the mentality that drives the chemical. Like, we forget that. We really do. It's like we think we're robots. Like, no, the chemicals create the feeling. It's like, no, the feeling creates the chemicals. If you perceive something as being a danger, your brain is going to pump you full of fear. If you don't see it as a danger, your brain doesn't do that. It kind of implies that there's more happening on your side of things than you might think. And that's the point, is that we have a degree of responsibility in everything. And it's funny to me because my daughter, who is 16, and on TikTok, she, as all of her friends are, she came and sat beside me one day, and I was just doom scrolling, as it were, on the For You page, and she's looking at the videos that are going by, for a few minutes, and she's watching me listen to them, and she's doing all that, and she's like, wow, your For You page is like so different than mine, because it's all like history stuff. It's all like philosophy. You know, there's some cat videos in there because I'm a big softie when it comes to cats. You know, things like that. But for the most part, it's all really interesting stuff. You know, like conversations, TED Talks, podcasts, things that are ultimately enriching. Stuff about the world, stuff about science, stuff about animals. You know, things like that. Marine biology, all kinds of shit. Right. And it's not like people doing funny dances and shit. Like, you don't see any of that on any of my For You page. And why do you think that is? Because I treat my For You page in the same way that I treat my thoughts. If you don't want to see more of that shit, just swipe. But if you're going to dwell for a few seconds on that because it triggered you and upset you, expect more of it. Isn't that funny, eh? Because TikTok doesn't give a fuck. None of the algorithms give a fuck. If you're paying attention to it, it's going to show you more. So if you're upset about it and you're watching it, it's going to show you more. Okay? If you're triggered by it and you're watching it, it's going to show you more. If you like having your ego stroked a little bit, it's going to show you more. And that's why it's so helpful in terms of it being a tool, because you can use this to practice curating how much attention you give to all of your fucking thoughts. I'm judging myself, swipe. You know, I'm thinking about the future, swipe. I'm worried about what other people think, swipe. You don't have to dwell on it any more than you have to dwell on that video of the person doing the fucking floss, because that shit's brutal.
Holy Christ, dude. How much it could be that. Like, and how symbolic, how much crossover there is. Like, it's the same sort of mechanism. Like, we see so many mechanisms that we experience, like, shown to us in different ways. And so it's funny. It's the same thing with like when someone's super judgmental about something. It's like you're just you're just judging yourself. You're just expressing the ways that you judge yourself outwardly, pinning it onto someone else. If you're, like, oh, my For You page, it's like, I don't know why it's so like it's this way. It's like that's so weird. And it's like, whether you know it or not, those are the things you're giving attention to. Those are the things you're paying attention to. And it's showing you all the time where your attention is. And so it goes like we've been talking about this week, just how much the actions inform, yourself, how much you think about yourself, the actions that you take. Like the things that you do that are clearly indicating that you're thinking about yourself. And so that's going to then play out in more situations. And the less you're doing things with yourself in mind, the more, the things you do change and the thoughts that you have start to shift. And the experience that you have starts to shift in terms of relaxation versus tension. Because like doing things for yourself individually is so common. Like it's such a, and like so many of the things that we do in the world are indicative of just believing that we are something separate from everything else, and like believing in the individual as truth. There's going to be less things that you do and focus on in that spot. But like, so looking for, the way to change, what's your answer to changing the world or whatever. It's like, well, we're not even looking at the world in the way. We're still incredibly self-involved in everything that we do. And if we're just a little bit more relaxed, there's a little bit less need to be self-involved, because it's not just me being tense and then figuring out how to feel better because the tension that I'm creating, because I keep focusing on myself and judging myself. And even if I don't feel like I'm judging myself, there's things that I avoid that maybe I would judge myself for. Certainly. And it's just like, oh, I don't like doing that. It's like, maybe you don't like doing it and you've tried it a bunch, or maybe you don't like doing it because you think you're not good at it. And it's going to be a spot in which you get uncomfortable judging yourself or looking a certain way because you're holding yourself up very highly. And we can convince ourselves that we just don't like something because we, I don't know, judge ourselves for it because we're still holding on to that, idea like I am something that I can judge or think about.
Oh yeah, no, that's exactly it. And again, like it's such a varied spectrum because immediately when you start talking about, just relax. Like the world has really got to relax in the same way that when you have a Charlie horse, you don't tense up to fix it, right? It changes things, but that's a hell of a Charlie horse. And you're looking at a world where brutal things do happen. People are kidnapped, people are murdered. There are drug cartels. There is human trafficking. There's all this shit, and you look at that and you're like, okay, that's going to take a lot of relaxation to fix, right? Because all of those people are in a state of needing control, or in a state of fear, or in a state of competition, or in a state of something that's generational, especially when it comes to like the drug cartels and things like that. Like often that's going like down the line. Like you work for them because your parents or your dad worked for them or something like that. Like, there's a lot of history there. And so for all this to change, for all these people to walk away, for people to stop gravitating towards that way of life, there has to be a whole shift on the other side of the fucking spectrum in terms of the rest of the world. Because if we're at all in a spectrum of selfishness, and that spectrum changes, all of a sudden one end of it becomes less selfish. You actually start to create more selflessness in the world. Well, the other spectrum is going to start gravitating in the same direction, right? But the more selfish we become, the worse it gets on the far end of the spectrum, right? It's like, why are all these terrible things happening? Well, that's a great question. How many people have you competed with in your head today? Because it's all contributing. It's all contributing. Like there's a reason that, and specifically I'll talk about human trafficking. Like there's a reason that these people go to clubs looking for people who are there not paying attention, people who are looking for just to go home that night with somebody, or to have a good time because their ego needs a boost, or to distract themselves. This changes things. They prey upon people who aren't paying attention. What does that say? Why aren't we paying attention? Right? And as we start to pay attention to ourselves and our lives, the environment shifts. And I'm not saying we can end human trafficking by relaxing at home today. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that by relaxing at home where you are right now today, you change the environment for everyone. It doesn't take much. It just takes you being a little less competitive, a little less likely to make assumptions, a little less likely to make enemies, a little less likely to be in conflict with people. And that's what brings us closer together. That's what actually makes us start to reprioritize our life rather than just focusing on money or accumulation or wealth. We actually start to look at life, the full story, right? Which is why, again, that study was showing that people who use psilocybin over time just work less overtime. It's not because they can't, it's because they have reprioritized their life. They're looking at what life actually is, and the fact that material wealth will never make them more. Having more stuff doesn't make you more able to enjoy here and now. And so that's the reprioritization that changes things. But that changes everything. That changes the economy. It changes our need for more money. It changes our willingness to go and work for a job just for money when it's fucking brutal for our life, giving up all of our hours, giving up all of our say. Now they're looking at measuring brain waves in the workplace, just to make sure that you're paying attention. That shit's easy to fix. Don't take the job. Right? Enough people look at that and go, no, it won't work. But people will take the job because they're driven by their ego. People will take the job because they're driven by fear. They will take the job out of stress. They will take that job to be more. That's the mentality that has to shift. And then all of these other things that would take advantage of our ego will start to disappear because the ego's not there to be taken advantage of. It's very much like if you are a needy person, if you need to be in a relationship, you will find someone who will take advantage of your need.
And so both sides are always informing one another. Like the more you need something, the more there's going to be on the other side someone able to take advantage of that. We see that with authority too, like the more we need an authoritarian figure, the more opportunity there is for an authoritative figure to take advantage of someone who is in that spot. But we don't want to realize that we're always playing a role in things. Like, no, all this stuff's happening and I'm not doing anything that could possibly be contributing to what's going on right now. There's nothing I'm doing that's having any impact on anything, couldn't possibly be having to do with that. Like it's like I want to feel good about being able to point to something like, oh, that's fucked up. But I wouldn't dare think that there's anything I was doing because that's a bad thing and I'm a good person. Like, oh my God, it's so much that. And so and we don't want to look at the mentality. Also, we just want to look at the actions. Like, oh, that person's doing a bad thing. The thing they're doing is really fucked up. And we don't want to look at like, no, it's coming from somewhere though. Like it's coming from, they weren't born like just wanting to fucking kill the world or whatever other people and do all these harm. Like it stemmed from, likely a upbringing in a certain way, which, and then parents who then had a certain upbringing, who had a certain, and it's like there is this continuous sort of thing that you take it far enough and there's no beginning to that. It's just a mentality being expressed right now. But the idea that like, oh no, it is this black and white and it's totally separate from me just reinforces all the shit that's happening. And like you were saying on that spectrum of relaxation, it's not to say that, you know, you relaxing right here, right now is necessarily going to change everything overnight, but it does. It's like, what can you do in response to that, especially when we start to be honest with the fact that these things do stem from a mentality? It's like, not invest in that mentality yourself because the mentality is like a trunk that has a bunch of different branches. Some of those branches are like the horrendous, crazy shit. Some of the things are just, comparing yourself to someone else at work or even just wishing you were more like someone else. It's like that's contributing to this, that's watering the same tree that one of the branches is sex trafficking or murder.
Oh, and Hitler knew it, right? Because if you listen to what Hitler was doing, he was basically telling them, like, you don't deserve this. You don't deserve to be treated like this. The German people don't deserve to be looked at or looked down upon by the rest of the world. In fact, scientists are proving that the German people are actually more advanced. And who doesn't want that ego boost, right? Especially when you're in the middle of a depression where you've been judged for years because of a war that happened 20 years ago, and somebody comes along and he's just like, we're going to fix things, we're going to make it better because you deserve better, and you deserve better because you are better. And all of a sudden everybody's just like, yeah, oh fuck yeah. And it wasn't everybody, but it was enough. It was enough. And this is the reason that nobody wants to look at what was happening in Germany in the 30s. Like, we always want to look at World War II and go, Hitler was evil. But the reason we get so uncomfortable looking at it is because the German people weren't evil. They were just people like you and me that were ultimately caught up in something based on egotism, based on fear, based on the need to feel like more. And they got so caught up in it that it led them to the point where they were doing monstrous things. And by that point, it was too late to turn back. They were too deep in it. Right? So it's not that there was evil. There's just a lot of confusion, and in a state of lacking clarity, somebody will come over and take advantage of that. And this is why it's so important to be aware of that. You can't go out there and stop every shyster from trying to run his con, but you can be aware of the con. You can be aware of the mentality that drives the need to have that con. And it disempowers them. And when they're disempowered enough, there's the potential to change. That's when we stop trying to con people, is when we recognize it never actually works out. And it never gets us what we want. That's when we, quote unquote, turn over a new leaf. But if all the cons are failing, eventually you just start to realize it's pointless. It's a lesson in futility. You may as well just be honest. And that's exactly the lesson that we're learning with ourselves, aren't we? We're always conning ourselves into thinking we're in control. We're always conning ourselves into thinking that we're more or less. And when you look at that con for what it is, You give up. You go, fuck, it's never going to pay off. I'm tired of believing this con man in my head. And so you find yourself just taking the lesson in futility, letting go of control, letting go of the fact that letting go of the idea that you can ever think your way into being more. And you just live your life because you recognize the con. And that's exactly what we're doing in the long term, in the big picture. It's a collective understanding. It's a collective clarity that we're growing. It's not just individual, because there is no individual.
Oh man, that con man and the amount of enticing ways that it gets you to and I say it like it's something separate from me that I'm not just empowering as I go by focusing on it and even calling it a thing. It's like, oh my gosh. And like even that, like how often I'll hear something and then yeah, just think that there's some way for me to control my way out of it, kind of, as opposed to just being like, "Oh, yeah, that maybe that'll always be there," Maybe that, concern, fear, whatever, maybe it'll always be there. And in that spot where I'm like, I stop fighting it, I stop, like, trying to get rid of it, like, one day," it's like, kinda chills out, kinda settles down, and it's like how and we've talked about this a lot, quite a bit in the last couple weeks, just how much we're empowering it. We're wondering why it's so strong as we're giving it all of our strength, focusing on it, fighting it, defending ourselves from it, from the imaginary friend, the adversary, all that good stuff. But it's yeah, it's funny when you stop just fighting and putting up a fight because then it's like that's where your attention is too, is on that fight, is on that battle, is on because then it's like I gotta win the battle. It's like it's not a battle you can win, it's just a battle you can keep fighting forever or not fighting and stopping because there's nothing fighting back when you stop fighting. It's like if you had a mirrored sort of like in a video game or something, there's like a mirrored situation. So you're looking at one, controlling it, like fighting the other, but like the other one's doing the same exact actions as you go. And then you're just like, oh, what if I stopped fighting? Like the mirror, because it's a mirror, it stops fighting so much. And then when you put your hands up, it puts its hands up. And then you're like, oh, fuck. And then like the mirrored thing goes away and it's just you just there, just punching something that you're trying to, I don't know, to like think there's something else or like you can know or have control of something.
Very much reminds me of Fight Club. Absolutely. Speaking of which, we have a movie review of Fight Club. If anybody would like to go and watch that movie review, I highly recommend it because it's trippy. That movie's awesome. It was a lot of fun to review that. We have a few minutes left. I just wanted to mention to everybody, we're going to be on Patreon in about 17 minutes. If you'd like to join us, it's a tier 2 call. We have a 7-day free trial. If you haven't tried out Patreon, try out Patreon. We appreciate the support, but we also like having the opportunity to chat with you. We had somebody join us in the group yesterday, and they came in barrels ablazing, happy to be there, but also admitting like, I really look up to you guys. And immediately my thought was, you got to come to more of these groups so we can shit all over that. Right. And that really is the point of coming to these groups. So you can talk to us. You can recognize that we're just humans. We're exactly like you, in so many ways, dealing with uncertainty, wrestling with the temptation to think about ourselves. Right. And if you're looking up to us, that's not helping in any way, shape, or form. So I recommend joining us on Patreon. Come to a free group on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, or better yet, come to a retreat, because it will help more for you to recognize how much we are in this together rather than perceive us as being farther down a path that does not exist.
Well, fucking said. And I was having very similar conversation about that with a friend this morning, and just about that bar, the expectation. It's like, who the fuck am I maintain? Like, what good is that? Dude, that's not doing anyone any good. If I'm fucking trying to be perfect all the time and expecting myself to be perfect all the time, it's like, who is that good for? My own comfort? It's like, Jesus Christ, but it's not comfortable to try and do it. So like, what the fuck am I doing? So anyway, yeah, I mean, we're going through stuff all the time and it's always fun connecting and chatting and Yeah, because the groups are just fun. Like, sometimes we'll get into, like, deeper stuff. Sometimes we're just fucking around and sending memes back and forth and laughing and, like, just having a great time, and that's very much what the retreats are like, just a time to chill and hang out and have a good time and have some laughs. So, anyway, it's been a blast, and,
It has been a blast. Check out retreat details on the website, dualisticunity.com, and we'll see you on Patreon very shortly. Thanks so much for joining us.